Everybody, we are going to wait for the room to populate. We'll take a few seconds, and then we'll dive right into this morning's conversation. Looks like we already have several hundred of you. Bret and Mijal, thank you both for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Good to see you.
Likewise, despite the circumstances, despite the circumstances. Well, I think we can dive right in. Well, listen, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on really relatively short notice for today's discussion with SAPIR Editor-in-Chief Bret Stephens and with Maimonides Fund Scholar in Residence Dr. Mijal Bitton. It's been less than 48 hours since a gunman shot and killed the conservative political activist Charlie Kirk in broad daylight before some 3,000 people at Utah Valley University. It was an assassination caught on camera, the image and video spreading on various social media platforms and around the country within minutes of the murder itself. Others have already written about this, but this is by no means the only assassination or assassination attempt or spate of political violence in recent memory. Right? The attempt on Democratic Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, in 2011. The attempt on the life of Republican Congressman Steve Scalise in 2017. The plot to kidnap Democratic Governor Whitmer from Michigan in 2020. The attempt to kill then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi in her own home the following year. Last year, as we all recall, a bullet whizzed by the ear of then Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump. In April of this year, over Pesach, a Molotov cocktail was thrown into the house of Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro. In June, former House Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband were assassinated. We live in difficult times, and there's an undeniable wave of political violence coursing through the veins of our country. The Jewish community, of course, is by no means immune to this trend. Israeli embassy officials Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Lynn Milgram killed just this past May. Wesley LePatner, a business executive, a beloved Jewish communal leader, was gunned down in July. There's something about Kirk's assassination that makes this particular moment feel different. And I think the New York Times actually summed it up quite well in a headline that read as follows. After Kirk killing, Americans agree on one thing. Something is seriously wrong. We continue to live in an era of relentless polarization when an almost unbridgeable, yawning chasm between people of different political worldviews appears to be our forever reality. We're stuck in what Politico called the Gordian knot of political violence. The attack on Charlie Kirk was an attack on the very enterprise of the American experiment, the ability to speak one's mind without fear of violence. It is also an attack on the Jewish tradition and on the central mission of Sapir, which is to embrace this notion of machloket l'shem shamayim, the ability to see different opinions not as a threat, but as an opening for a conversation. And so, as we head into Shabbat in just a few hours, this is precisely what we wanted to do. And we want to engage in a conversation with two brilliant minds to really help us collectively make sense of this moment. Bret and Mijal, really appreciate you both being with us today and on such short notice.
It's a pleasure to
Yeah,
be with you.
same.
I'm going to ask Bret the first question. I just want to say to our audience, typically we ask you to submit questions, which we'll get to at the tail end of our conversation. But if there's anything that pops into your mind, do so right now, and I'll try to weave those questions in as best as possible into the discussion with Bret and Mijal. So, Bret, let's just start with you. I mean, you and I were texting when this happened, right? It was some 3 o'clock on Wednesday, 2 days ago. You saw the news. What was your instinctive reaction?
Well, I knew Charlie not very well, but so the the horror of it is magnified when you actually have a personal acquaintance with the victim, and magnified even more um, because, like so many people looking for news about what had happened on Wednesday, I watched the assassination itself, which is one of those things you simply can't unsee. Um, uh, you know, the the first thought I had was just how young Charlie is, 31 years old, um, father with two young children. And so I think the first and most important thing to say is, on a purely human level, how grotesque and heartbreaking this is. There's time and space for talking about the political implication of it, but a 31-year-old young man has been taken from this world, and his wife has been made a widow, and his children have become orphans. And that is, I think, something that is sort of missing from a lot of the immediate commentary, which kind of blows over um, the 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 meaning of an assassination, a murder, to look maybe a little too quickly at all the political implications, or how we should think about Charlie's politics, or this or that statement captured by um, various agitprop organizations that make a living by trying to find every bad thing someone has said in his or her past. Um, the second aspect, of course, and I guess we have to delve into the larger issues here, um, is that uh, we live in an era that has bred people to believe that what they think politically is who they are morally. You're a progressive, well, you're a bad person, or vice versa. You're a Trump voter, you're a bad person. And because of that conflation with political opinion and personal virtue, I think it has created a climate in which these assassinations have become um, more common, and more likely to happen in the future. One name you didn't mention, Hanan, in your list is the name of Brian Thompson, the healthcare executive gunned down, I guess I have to say allegedly, by this young man, Luigi Mangione, um, uh, because of the crime of the job that he had, working as head of a big, or a head of a big healthcare company, totally irrespective of the fact that Brian Thompson was a boy from Iowa who lived the American dream, came up from a working class background, and was by all accounts a magnificent husband and father. But his crime was simply that he worked in the wrong industry and was therefore deemed guilty. The United States has lived through periods like this before. There is a long history of political assassinations. That history was particularly bad at the turn of the century. Um, and it's bad now. And I think it has a lot to do with the way in which we have raised a generation to believe that who you are politically um, is all there is to know about you. And I think that is part of the heartbreak of this moment.
Right? The notion that you are the sum total of your political convictions is not necessarily a healthy ingredient for our country. There was to your point, Brett, there was a YouGov poll in September 2024, which said something to the effect of nearly half of Americans think members of the opposing political party are downright evil. Among Republicans who believe Trump won in 2020, 75% agree Democrats are evil, and among Democrats, less than half say the same about Republicans. Mijal, you are not just a scholar in residence at Maimonides Fund, you're also the Rosh Kehillah at the downtown Minyan in New York City, which means you are at the helm of an institution that likely has many different outlooks and perspectives. I'm wondering, how are you going into this Shabbat, with the assassination on Charlie Kirk, knowing that there are people in your congregation that have many different political outlooks? How do you intend to kind of thread the needle on this issue?
Yeah, well, first I just want to echo what Bret said about the level of human tragedy uh, of this, and I just want to add that part of why I think Charlie's murder has shaken so many of us is that so many generations are growing up right now on social media, and Charlie was somebody who really embodied using social media. So millions and millions of individuals just felt like they knew him in a very personal way. And I have been struck by I live in a politically very diverse universe, different communities that have different political views. And I have been struck how, in some, I'll speak here of my Jewish communities, there has been almost like mourning, real mourning for him, and in others of other political persuasions, either silence or confusion, and in very fringe places, unfortunately, the kind of reactions that you just described of this was my enemy. So in terms of your question, Hanan, I think that we desperately need responsible leadership right now, all across America and in Jewish communities, and we need to have the ability to say that we hold strong views and we don't need to agree with each other's views, but that there is something incredibly toxic and poisonous about our inability to mourn the murder of another person because their views were such that we disagreed with them. The poll that you just mentioned, Hanan, about half of Americans that see
Hmm.
the other political side as evil, I do think that the other half of Americans that believe that we can work with those across the aisle and who believe, I'll maybe speak for myself, who believe that the real danger comes from the extremes on both sides, and that we need to be able to have a way of talking to each other, that we have the fight of our lifetimes right now to fight for this country and to fight for our ability to have a liberal civilization, liberal in the sense that we can talk with each other and live together, even when we disagree.
Michal, listening to you, it brought to mind the notion that every living president issued a statement condemning the death, lamenting the persistent presence of political violence. But there was a line in George W. Bush's statement that stood out for me. He wrote that members of other political parties are not our enemies; they're our fellow citizens. And it reminded me obviously of Obama's famous DNC speech where he talked about there aren't red states and blue states, we're the United States. And both presidents in different times and in different moments of our political history reminding us of our common creed. But that feels exponentially more challenging now. I love that notion of they're not our enemies, they're our fellow citizens. But why does it not feel that way for so many Americans? Michal, your thoughts, and then Bret, curious your take.
Well, I think it's the way that Bret described it before, that we've come to think of politics and morality as intertwined. Everything is politics. There is no person. And there's also this very pernicious idea that, became very popular on campus and, of course, has gone everywhere, that words can be violence and that you can have a very subjective understanding of harm. So once you have such a subjective, almost psychological, therapeutic understanding of harm, you can look at opposite political views, and you can begin to psychologically internalize and feel this person is threatening me in a way that I have to respond. So I think we had this ideological takeover of the idea of harm and safety to such an extent that we have a whole generation of young Americans that many of them feel, like viscerally feel, when this person says the following about this political issue, this is harm and dangerous. And when you have so much irresponsible discourse saying that the stakes are so high that every statement is like the end of democracy and that everything is dangerous, that creates a really volatile situation.
The other aspect here is that there has been a kind of a great sorting, if you will, uh, along ideological lines. I'd have to go back and look at the data, but I remember several years ago reading that more and more Americans live in zip codes where pretty much all of their neighbors will have voted as they voted. I mean, if you live in let's say uh, Brooklyn, you probably are not encountering, at least certain neighborhoods of Brooklyn, you aren't encountering a lot of Republicans. And similarly, if you're living in Plano, Texas, haven't met many Democrats. That wasn't the case 40 or 50 years ago. You would encounter, Democrats would encounter Republicans and vice versa on a human level all the time, as neighbors, as fellow colleagues in one walk of life or another, and that human encounter or that personal encounter just humanizes. Secondly, and Mijal pointed this out, more and more of life is now spent online and on social media in silos that gather people of like-minded opinions together, where they kind of there's a kind of a whirlwind or a tornado effect in those social media or even media silos. I mean, there aren't many places, maybe I can think of Bill Maher's show or just a handful of other fora, where people of different opinions actually are forced to sit side by side. And so I don't think it's altogether surprising that this has led to a kind of process of ideological tribalization. And when you tribalize, you end up with results very much like the Balkans in the 1990s, or other places in the world where violence is normalized. The thing is, Hanan, I actually think there is a tremendous appetite, a large market for a different kind of conversation. For many years, I had a conversation with my liberal colleague Gail Collins in the New York Times, and the kind of the spirit of it was like, just keep talking. We emerged we entered the conversation as friends, and we left as friends. And it was extraordinary to notice how popular that was among New York Times readers. Maybe because, many of them maybe love to hate me, but time and again, what I would hear is it's so nice to have a moment where we can witness agreeable disagreement. And if you looked at our column on the New York Times, it was routinely at the top of the popularity list. But if you looked for it on social media, it was nowhere to be found. Twitter had no use for it. Blue Sky had no use for it. And I think the reason is that our conversation just did not conform to the algorithms of outrage that social media tends to favor. So we have to find a way to shift those algorithms. We have to find a way to show the market that there is time and space for the kinds of conversations we were trying to model at the Times, or we try to model in SAPIR. It's there, and I think it actually could be successful and profitable. Nobody's doing it, and that's what you might call a market failure.
Brett, is there anything about media coverage leading up to this assassination or of this assassination that made it more permissive? Like how would you understand the broader media marketplace's role, if at all, in creating the political culture that allows for something like this to happen, or not?
Well, look, I was heartened by the fact that immediately after the assassination, some talking heads lost not their heads, but their jobs for some of the exceptionally hateful comments. I think there was a moment after the assassination where partisans really, there was a deep intake of breath. But I think the media has, in some ways, uh, and again, media is a plural noun. There are plenty of actors speaking in different keys, but we do have a problem both in kind of the right-wing media of, say, Fox News and its, kind of satellites, but also in the more liberal establishment media of anthropologizing, if you will, the other side, of not understanding them as anything other than a kind of a bizarre cult wedded to an unintelligible moral code. And if you listen to some of the right-wing voices talking about, the New York press, you would think that those of us who work in the New York media, wake up and mutilate our children just for fun. And you see mirror images of that, by the way, in establishment press talking about conservatives as a collection of um, bigots, homophobes, anti-Semites, racists, and so on. And that too is just purely a caricature. And there really has to be an effort, a leadership effort at the top of these organizations to introduce, to be serious about this idea of viewpoint diversity, which we have tried to promote through the SAPIR Institute, of understanding that, yes, sure, there are always going to be people whose views are genuinely awful. But by and large, most of the people who are partisans on one side or the other are well-intended people trying to create a better, fairer, more transparent, more decent, more robust democracy. And even if their means differ, their aims are the same. And keeping that thought top of mind in the media business would I think be transformative. Would it risk ticking off very loud constituencies who are out there with their followers on Twitter or Blue Sky? Yeah, it would do that. But that's the role of courageous leadership in corporate America, and I'd like to see some more courage, and this may be the occasion for it.
Yeah, if ever there was a time, it feels like it is certainly now. Michal, just going back to you, going from media to, let's say, the synagogue, and the question I asked earlier, I want to just push on a little bit more. You really oversee a microcosm of, I presume, different political outlooks that reflect ultimately the broad majority of the United States. What Bret articulated and talked about, the study of how people who live in the same zip code oftentimes have the same homogenous political outlook. I got to say, my own experience, when I go to synagogue, I'm often sometimes critiqued from my own perspective. Let's say that might be a little bit more progressive, but over a kiddish, I'm literally in conversation and
You're
dialogue with people
basically a
with whom I
communist,
disagree.
Renan.
Yeah, right. So, Michal, what do you like? Do you sense that in your own shul or synagogue? And what is there within the Jewish tradition
Yeah.
historically that what tools exist to help us, address this moment?
Yeah, so as a rule, in terms of synagogue and religious work, I actually believe quite firmly that partisanship should stay out of the pulpit. And I think it's really a sacred responsibility for religious leaders to create communities where people who vote differently from each other can pray together, eat together, celebrate together, and where partisanship is not so much part of the explicit discourse of the community. So that's something that's been really important to me. And it's a fine line to thread because I believe that Judaism and the Torah are political. Our sacred texts have plenty to say about all sorts of issues that we all grapple with and think about and argue about. But there is a difference between politics and partisanship, and between, I think, it's a corruption of our sacred tradition when we try to retrofit it into narrow partisan policies, it's taking something timeless and holy and sacred and eternal and making it time bound and often bastardizing it for the sake of just this current moment. So in terms of my community, I actually think we've done a really good job over the past few years to create a particular environment where there's people who vote differently from each other and they're able to be together in community. And I'm proud of that. Not every community has this culture, and I know there are some clergy who actually have made their pulpit very much tied to partisan politics. But I do think even I don't want to pat myself in the back like we've done well. I do think that all religious leaders and especially Jewish leaders should take this moment seriously and speak about our tradition because our tradition has so much to say about our ability to live together even as we disagree. You mentioned before, Hanan, in your introduction, the idea of machloket l'shem shamayim, which is a dispute or disagreement for the sake of heaven, which classically has been used to describe the disagreement between the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, two major rabbinic figures. And interestingly, I was learning recently some rabbinic narratives that describe the disagreements between these sages in very violent terms, actually. There's some in the Jerusalem Talmud, there's a narrative that says that they're arguing so much that they literally kill each other in the heat of the argument. Now, that's not necessarily read, literally or historically. I think it's a metaphor as to how much learning can be violent. But the rabbis, by using language that does not shy away from passion and pathos, right, in terms of what disagreement can look like in the Bet Midrash, in the house of study, the rabbis really invite us and demand from us to figure out how can we have a religious and cultural and intellectual milieu where we don't just tolerate disagreement, but we believe that we must have disagreement in order to sharpen our own views and in order to have a better community. We have so much work to do, not only to figure out how to tolerate this, but how to enshrine it as a value. And I'll just add one more thing here. I'm going to speak. It's funny sometimes when things happen in the world, I have reactions, and I sometimes wish I could stop reacting as a Jew to everything. Right? Everything is like, well, I feel this very much as a Jew. But as a Jew, I'll just say all of this political violence and Charlie Kirk's murder, there's something also very scary there because Jews as minorities, we have flourished in societies that have made space for difference and for dissent. The second that we have a society in which there's violence against dissent is normalized and accepted and celebrated, that becomes very dangerous for minorities, especially for the Jewish community. So I think we have a responsibility for the sake of our country, for the sake of our community, and for the sake of our values to figure out, like, I don't know if I can change the algorithm, Bret, you were describing so powerfully how toxic it is, but each and every one of us, we have a role to play in our own communities to be able to make this better.
And I would add, this is if we don't slam on the proverbial brakes, this is going to get much worse. I just did an event in New York City at the Stryker Center, Temple Emmanuel, with my old friend Yaakov Katz, interviewing him about his book. There was a loud protest outside, which the chanters were accusing me of genocide. The event was infiltrated by about a dozen hecklers who had a plan to stand up and scream. I'm glad the worst they did was scream, but the atmosphere for those of us who are in somewhat public life is becoming genuinely scary. And the level of security that is required simply to have a conversation about a book. In this case, Yaakov's book was about Israel's failures prior to October 7th. A brilliant book, but a historical book. When that conversation isn't possible because the speakers are going to be afraid of who's getting in. We're entering into a world in which any kind of public conversation isn't going to be possible, and we're entering into it at a speed which not only scares me, it really takes my breath away. Just how quickly this is unfolding. I didn't live through the 1960s, but I sometimes think just how quickly the country seemed to change from, say, 1965 to 1969. And we're going downhill at perhaps an even a faster rate. So something uh, has to change, and it has to come from leaders in corporate America. I don't place too much faith in leaders in political America, but in corporate America, who are willing to say, we are going to be the sponsors and protectors of brave and difficult conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting that you reference that corporate leaders should be the ones to sort of take the mantle and set the tone. I see a question from Stephen Weiss. I hope I'm not mispronouncing your last name, who asked, would it not help for our leaders, starting at the very top with President Trump, as well as the Democrat and Republican leaders of Congress, to set the example for all citizens of our country by ceasing inflammatory rhetoric and even to have televised discussions between members from both sides of the aisle discussing important issues? And reading Stephen's question, we happen to live in an era of profound distrust of institutions of all kind and institutional leaders of all kind, politically, corporate, media, etc. So, is there someone who's big enough to sort of own this moment, who has the perception of having the right moral clarity from the left and the right, who can help, you know, tone down the rhetoric and take the temperature down a little bit?
You
Do
know,
you think of anybody?
well, leaving personalities aside, I think the most important task is that those of us who are on the right do more to police our side, and those on the left their side. It's wonderfully easy after an event like Charlie Kirk's assassination to talk about the horrible rhetoric on the woke left and the demonization of right-wing figures. And by the way, there's a lot to that case, right? But first of all, I don't think anyone on the left is going to listen particularly attentively if Donald Trump or figures in the MAGA movement suddenly discover the awfulness of inflammatory rhetoric against one's political opponents. It just cuts no ice, right? What will actually work is when you have leaders on the left, leaders with credibility on that side, speaking to their own partisans, and the same is true, on the other side. I think it was an exceptionally important moment in American history, and I know Sam Tannenhaus's biography tries to pour cold water on the legacy of Bill Buckley, but Bill Buckley in the 1950s decreed that anyone who wrote for the American Mercury, which was an anti-Semitic right-wing publication at the time, would not write for the National Review. He basically said, we are going to impose some moral hygiene on the right, particularly when it comes to right-wing anti-Semitic voices. And I think that was an exceptionally important thing, and at that time, a brave thing for him to do. We can talk about Bill Buckley's legacy at another time, but that was the kind of act which actually showed some moral courage when you kind of face up to the partisans on your own side. I think that's the only way we're going to move forward. Having the right accuse the left and the left accuse the right simply traps us in the same poisonous cycle.
Yeah. Michal, what's your take on that question and Brett's response?
Yeah, no, I agree. I would also say, and I know that we've SAPIR has done great work on this, but I think we are in desperate need for a transformation across universities and college campuses. A lot of many of these trends often originate or become quite popular in academia and then they don't stay there. They just go out. But if you have politically homogeneous classrooms with professors who there's so many polls that come from different universities showing professors who all vote the same and think the same way. It's very difficult for that if that is our culture of education in this country, and that is how young Americans are being shaped and taught, then that has to be part of the solution as well.
Yeah, there was I'm sure you saw this poll. It came out recently from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, which really highlighted that too many college students are abandoning the ideal of engaging in political disagreements that don't become violent. I think the number is 34% of college students said they supported using violence in some circumstances to stop campus speech. And, it's reflective of a concerning trend that, has persisted for some time. Jonathan Haidt writes about it in his book, Coddling of the American Mind. And it obviously morphed into this sort of catastrophic moment in 2023, 2024, after 10/7. It's no surprise that this attack occurred on a college campus. But what do we do? What can we do to ensure that this doesn't become sort of this moment in time, and with these trends in place, that we can work with kids or young adults who are college age to reconsider that perspective? Bret or Michal, either you want to take that?
Let Mijal take this.
Well, I don't know if I have a direct specific question, but maybe I just want to say that I think part of the challenge is that many of us who are against this kind of violence, we tend to prefer moderation. And very often we have all of these algorithms and spaces that just listen to the loudest voices that are the ones pushing against this moderation. So I think we need a movement of American moderates and centrists who become almost radical about moderation. By radical, I mean it's like we realize we have a fight, that we have a battle, that it's not enough to just say these really bad things are happening to our country, but that I think in every generation you can have a moment in civilization in which your civilization is at risk, and we don't know how this is going to go and how this is going to be written and what the future of this great American experiment will unfold. But if we don't take it seriously, that it is at risk and that it is not going to necessarily have a good ending unless we fight for it, then I am afraid that we don't set ourselves up to really do what we have to do.
What I have been writing about for years now is what I call the dying art of disagreement. And by the way, um, I largely endorse what Mijal said. I know there are serious efforts by exceptionally thoughtful people. Daniel Lubetsky, a philanthropist, the founder of Kind Bars, and our fellow Latino Jew, has been working very hard on this. But the problem with moderates is that they're moderate. It's not the flavors are vanilla and strawberry. It's often not exciting. But great disagreements can be bitter, sharp, pointed, right? And so long as they reside in the world of ideas, so long as there is an overarching notion, and Mijal put this beautifully, that your opponent doesn't weaken you, your opponent actually strengthens you. He sharpens your thinking. He whets the intellectual dagger, if you will, to use a somewhat violent metaphor, by which you can slay your opponent in speech, right? Then we can have these kinds of robust discussions where the institutions that I think have most failed in this respect are universities. Universities have become ideological monocultures, where opinions range from the left to the far left. I'm speaking in generalizations here, but I think this is largely true. Professors give lip service to the idea of viewpoint diversity, but then treat views that are outside of their comfort zone as essentially morally beyond the pale. there is way too little effort to introduce young students, students of the age of, Luigi Mangione and Thomas Crooks, the would-be assassin of Donald Trump, and what looks to be the just apprehended suspect in the Utah case, 22 years old, to give these young people a sense of the delight and satisfaction of intellectual combat that never ever reaches into actual violence. And again, I come back to this word leadership. University leaders will tell their trustees, "Oh, we believe in viewpoint diversity," but they never actually practice it. They never insist to their faculty that something has to change. They never go out of the way to ensure that there is a robust climate of civil but vigorous intellectual disagreement on their campuses. And when that happens, universities become factories for cadres, which is the opposite of what a university should do. My experience at the University of Chicago is that it turned me into a skeptic, most of all a skeptic about myself. But that's because Chicago provided this unique intellectual environment of intense intellectual challenge. And what we need to do is find a way to bring that Chicago formula to thousands of campuses nationwide. I think that's the chief route to our national salvation.
I'm mindful of time, so I want to get to one final question from the audience, and then we'll wrap up. Anonymous asks, and this actually goes back to one of the original questions that I inquired about at the very beginning. Says something to the effect as the follows: Why does the Charlie Kirk assassination feel different than the attempts or the assassinations of elected officials, all of whom I referenced at the very beginning? This person writes, it almost feels more like Martin Luther King Jr., just a private person killed for their views. Is that right? Now, I think, by the way, some people might hear that and say, you can't compare Charlie Kirk to MLK. But I think the point is that here is someone who was not a political figure, even if he was incredibly politically active. He was someone who had certain views that a part of our community abhorred and a part of our community rallied around. But there's something that's different about this, you know? I mean, the president flew the flag at half staff. I know they're very close. There was a moment of silence in various professional sporting events. There's just something about this that feels a little bit different than all those efforts from before. Can you just help us understand why that feeling is the way it is? Assuming you share it. Let's start with you, Michal.
So, I mean, I alluded to this earlier, but I think that there's something about the he was 31. He was so young. He was a family man. Like his family identity was very much part of his persona. He was like the question said, he was a private citizen, not involved in politics, which I think we often assume comes with a certain amount of ugliness and risk. And I just want to bring back the role of social media here, though, because I think that his presence on social media was the kind that you had millions of people that felt like they knew him, like he was a friend. That's the kind of mourning that I saw in some circles of so many young people who were like this is not like some official somewhere. This is like a very, very human tragedy that really hits very powerfully. So I think we can't underestimate how much his presence and persona on social media really humanized him to so many.
There are a ton of really fantastic questions, and some of which I think our panelists answered over the course of the conversation. So I think I just want to end with, the following, which is something to the effect of, what do you think the implications are for the Jewish community? At
Wait,
at
can
the
I?
risk of neighbor,
I think Brett is back.
Brett's back. All
Sorry, I'm
right.
Yeah,
back.
yeah, go for it.
What do you got, Brett?
Um, I think it's important to say something. I think this is one reason why it hits so hard, going back to the previous question. Charlie's politics were very far from my own. In some ways, his arrival in the Republican Party was my departure. I hewed to a very different kind of conservatism than I think the more MAGA-inflected conservatism that he espoused. But Charlie did believe in debate. It was his style was let's talk, let's ask me anything. I think that was essentially the his the way he operated on college campuses. He loved to mix it up. And I think that's one reason this hits so hard, in addition, of course, to the fact that he was young, he was rising, he had this beautiful fan. Um, he he practiced a form of vigorous citizenship, and that form is now under attack. Those of us who practice it are frankly afraid, and the vividness, the grotesque vividness with which so many of us had to witness his murder brings it home that much harder. And I think that's what makes it such a moment.
I want to just do a little bit of kibud aim. My mother actually asked the question of the two of you. And
Uh-oh.
she asked as follows. Yes, Pam Weissman. Um, Instead of agreeing to disagree, can't we begin to try to ask questions to the other side? Try and imagine a panel that will instead of saying to each other, yeah, well, what about this? Ask the other person to elaborate on their perspective. For one side to ask the other, okay, well, tell me more. What are your thoughts on that? I will say, Ema, one thing that we also do at the SAPIR debates, which we had in May, and the next one will be in October, we finish every debate, right, where we ask each of the debaters to highlight one good point from the other side that they found to be cogent, convincing, something they hadn't considered, to sort of create this culture of active listening that has become increasingly more and more challenging. So how do we create that en masse? But your thoughts, Bret and Mijal, in response to my mom's question.
Well, yes, I think that a lot of what we're talking about begins with humility, with understanding that we don't know everything, and that we have to be curious about. We have to be curious also, I would say, about the most generous version of our opponent's argument. I find that part of what social media does. Brett spoke before about how it isolates us, but it does so even as it exposes us to the most grotesque version of our opponent's argument, as though that is the norm, by bringing the worst examples and just having this outrage machine. So I think we desperately need this. I think it's very much a Jewish value. So for those of us doing work in the Jewish community, this is what the Talmud is basically, just questions going back and forth and preserving every opinion. And maybe I'll just say something personal here. I know for me, I had a couple of years in grad school where I was beginning to be, I would say, like in an epistemic bubble, to the extent that I couldn't have conversations with members of my own family because I would just get so upset. I left our family WhatsApp chat a couple of times. And then there was like a process of encountering different views and actually just finding myself feeling that I didn't understand the other side. And that moment when you're like, I don't think I understand why you would feel this way, and I can't evaluate you because I don't understand you, that I think is the beginning of our ability to be able to be together and interact with each other.
The word curiosity is really a wonderful word, and I'm often reminded that the antidote to contempt is curiosity. Western philosophy begins with Socrates' assertion that what I know is I know nothing, right? And then, of course, Socrates annoys everyone by going around and interrogating the supposedly wise and underscoring the fact that they don't know too much either, right? But it is a wonderful and clarifying sensibility when you proceed from a standpoint of uh, curiosity and sufficient self-awareness of how much you don't know. And when you work as hard at being a listener as you work at being a talker. And I know I'm in a business in which I'm basically a professional talker, so it doesn't come easily to me. But intentional listening is a skill that needs to be practiced. You know, sometimes you're in a marital argument or some kind of argument, and the person who is angry at you is so infuriated by your behavior that they can't quite find the words, right? And so it's easy then to mock the lack of eloquence on your opponent's side. But that emotion often masks a serious point that struggles simply to articulate itself because it is saturated by emotion. We have to listen in a much more serious way to those whom we contemn with a T as sort of fools and bad people. Even if they're mistaken, there is something to what they're trying to communicate that is important. It's important for us to hear, even if the argument fails, the argument and the fact that they hold those views remains an important fact in our political life. You know, so to those of you on the call who are to the left of center, um, listen a little harder to what the MAGA crowd is saying, because indeed many things have gone badly wrong, certainly in their lives, in the way in which they encounter their American experience. And the exact same thing needs to be said of the right in its own, I think, often caricaturish condemnations uh, of the left. I'm not quite sure how we get there. I mean, I do know that conversations like this one matter. I think leadership in media matters. I think academic leadership matters perhaps more than anything, but it has to go back to something even more basic, which is the way in which we are raising our children um, to uh, uh, to experience and encounter opposing point of views at home and in school and on the playground with that spirit of humility and curiosity, of not knowing it all and knowing you don't know it all. So it's even more foundational than what happens when you enter your 20s or 30s. It goes back to the very beginning.
Well, I'll just say I love that message for this time in the Jewish calendar, which is we're in the month of Elul and going to the new year. And so much of this time really asks us to have self-reflection and to begin with ourselves and figure out where we can be part of the solution.
I love that. I think this might actually be a really good note to end on. I'll just ask you each one more question. What is the implication of this moment for the Jewish community? And what is the responsibility of the Jewish community in this moment? So not just how does it impact us, but what are we called upon to do to kind of course correct to the extent we can for the broader polity that is American society? Big question, not easy. Welcome either of you to jump in, and then we'll wrap.
You know, when we started SAPIR almost 5 years ago, one of the markers I laid down is that I wanted to publish people I didn't agree with. I wanted to publish voices I didn't previously know. Now, it's true, I don't publish just any voice. Um, there is a boundary line. There are people that I don't want to publish, but I wanted a tent, but I wanted a large tent. I think, and initially, when we first subtitled the publication, it was a journal of Jewish conversations. We decided to change that to Ideas for a Thriving Jewish Future, but it still remains a place of conversation. You know, conversation is fundamentally different from argument. The purpose of an argument is to win it, right? The purpose of a conversation is to listen and to enrich one another. And I think Jews, if our culture and our traditions mean anything, it is this practice of being in constant conversation with one another, being bound together as a family is by a sense of fellow of common destiny and a sense of needing each other. but also a sense of needing to reflect different points of view in the same space for the benefit of everyone in that space, wherever they come out on one side of a controversy or another.
We didn't touch on this, and I don't think now is the appropriate time to dwell on it, but I'm just going to name it as something for the future. But I do think we are going to also need to have a conversation about Charlie was involved in different efforts to push back against some of the ugliest poison of anti-Semitism in the very online fringe right. And I do think that the Jewish community, especially those who are involved in right-wing politics and in left-wing politics, that each of us are going to need to figure out what do we do to uplift centrist voices in our side and to push back against some of the most harmful and dangerous things. And to me, if there's one lesson that I take from all this as a Jewish America, is that part of the battle for Jewish safety is the battle for a healthy America, a flourishing America, America where we can have robust disagreements with our fellow citizens. So I think we need to keep that in mind and to make sure that even as we think about our own communal interests and positions, that we don't forget the broader work of really fighting for a strong America.
Yeah, amen to both of those things. I was talking briefly to my brother-in-law, Jordan, before this conversation, and asked him like, "What do we do? Like, what do we do in this moment? Should we look to our leaders? What should our response be?" And he said, and something I agree with, and you both touched upon this notion of we each have a responsibility to do these small acts, deeply personal small acts. Speak kindly to your Uber driver. Be nice to the person you're sitting next to in synagogue. Enter into a conversation, Bret, as you said, with a spirit of humility and curiosity. Do, Mijal, as you said, read the most generous interpretation of the other person's argument. Civility is ultimately built brick by brick by brick with these small acts. And if there's a call to action, it's precisely that. Everyone should take stock of this moment. As we head into the month of Elul, we should do a collective societal cheshbon hanefesh, interrogation of our societal soul and our own personal soul, and do what we can to lower the temperature and make sure that we create a country that is the best version of itself. So each of you are doing that in your own respective ways. Mijal and Bret, I thank you both very much for joining us on such short notice. I thank all of you for joining us on such short notice, and wishing everybody a peaceful, restful Shabbat Shalom. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.